The morning air was thick with smoke, and the distant sound of artillery fire echoed across the valley. Maria Volkov stood at the edge of the village, watching as families hurriedly packed their belongings into wagons and carts. Children cried in their mothers' arms while elderly grandparents struggled to carry precious family photographs and heirlooms. The enemy forces were advancing faster than anyone had expected. "We have maybe 3 hours before they reach us," announced Captain Petrov, the local military commander, his voice grim. "Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. The roads to the east are still clear, but not for long." Maria wiped her hands on her apron, her mind racing. As the village's head nurse, she had spent the last 15 years caring for these people. She knew every family, every child, every elderly person who might struggle to make the dangerous journey to safety. Her small medical clinic had become the heart of the community, and now she was being asked to abandon it all. The captain approached her directly. "Maria, you need to leave with the first group. Your medical skills will be needed at the refugee camp. We can't afford to lose you." But Maria's attention was drawn to old Mrs. Kozlov, who sat on her doorstep refusing to move. The 80-year-old woman had buried 3 sons in the war and declared she would rather die in her own home than flee like a frightened animal. Nearby, the Petrov family struggled with their disabled son Anton, whose wheelchair couldn't navigate the rough terrain ahead. Young mother Svetlana held her newborn baby while trying to comfort her terrified 5-year-old daughter. "How many people are still in the village?" Maria asked, her nurse's instincts taking over. 487 souls, the captain replied, including the children and elderly who can't move quickly. "We're doing our best, but the convoy will be slow and vulnerable on the mountain roads." Maria looked toward the approaching smoke clouds on the horizon. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy would show no mercy to civilians. Stories of burned villages and mass executions had already reached them from neighboring areas. These families weren't just statistics. They were her patients, her friends, her community. "There has to be another way," she murmured, studying the terrain maps spread across a makeshift table. "What about the old mining roads through the northern hills?" "They're dangerous, but they might be unguarded." Captain Petrov shook his head. "Those paths haven't been used in decades. They're probably blocked by landslides, and we don't have time to scout them properly. It would be suicide to lead civilians through unknown territory with enemy patrols in the area." As if to emphasize his point, another explosion echoed in the distance, closer this time. Several women screamed and children began crying louder. The panic was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about her late husband, killed 2 years earlier while serving as a battlefield medic. He had always said that sometimes the most dangerous path was actually the safest one, because enemies never expected you to take foolish risks. "I know these mountains," she said quietly. "My father was a mining engineer. He used to take me on those trails when I was a girl. Some of the paths are still passable, and they lead directly to the valley on the other side, avoiding all the main roads." The captain stared at her. "Maria, you can't be serious. Even if some trails are still open, you'd be leading nearly 500 people through unmarked territory, possibly straight into enemy hands. And you'd be doing it alone. I can't spare any soldiers to escort you." "Then I'll go alone to scout the route first," Maria declared, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "If I can find a safe passage, I'll come back for the others. If not—" She shrugged, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "This is madness," Captain Petrov exclaimed. "You're talking about walking directly into the most dangerous area, with no backup, no communication, and no guarantee of success. You could be captured, killed, or simply lost in the wilderness." Maria picked up her medical bag and slung it over her shoulder. She looked around at the frightened faces surrounding her. The children who had scraped their knees in her clinic, the mothers she had helped deliver babies, the old men whose blood pressure she monitored monthly. "These people trust me," she said simply. "I've been taking care of them for 15 years. I'm not going to abandon them now just because the situation has become difficult." The sound of engines rumbling in the distance made everyone freeze. Enemy vehicles were definitely getting closer. Time was running out and a decision had to be made immediately. Captain Petrov grabbed Maria's arm. "If you're determined to do this insane thing, at least take some supplies. And promise me, if you encounter enemy forces, you'll turn back immediately. Don't try to be a hero." Maria looked at him with a sad smile. "Captain, I stopped trying to be a hero a long time ago. Now I'm just trying to be a human being." As she prepared to leave, old Mrs. Kozlov struggled to her feet and approached. "Child," the elderly woman said, pressing a small religious medal into Maria's palm. "May God watch over you on this dangerous journey." The weight of 487 lives now rested on Maria's shoulders as she turned toward the treacherous mountain paths that might lead to salvation or death. Maria's boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground as she made her way up the steep mountain trail. The familiar path of her childhood looked different now, overgrown with thorny bushes and partially blocked by fallen rocks. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier, and every sound made her heart race with fear. She had been walking for 2 hours when she heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching from the south. Quickly ducking behind a large boulder, Maria watched as 3 military aircraft flew low over her village, their dark silhouettes ominous against the gray morning sky. Smoke was now rising from several buildings, and the distant rattle of machine gun fire confirmed her worst fears. The enemy had arrived ahead of schedule. 487 people, she whispered to herself, using the number like a prayer. I have to find a way. The old mining road was worse than she had remembered. Sections had completely collapsed, forcing her to climb over dangerous rock slides where one wrong step could send her tumbling hundreds of feet down the mountainside. Her medical bag grew heavier with each mile, but she refused to abandon the supplies that might save lives later. As she rounded a particularly treacherous bend, Maria froze. Fresh tire tracks in the mud indicated that vehicles had recently used the supposedly abandoned route. Her heart sank as she realized enemy patrols might already be controlling the mountain passes. The safe escape route she had hoped to find could actually be a trap, but then she noticed something that gave her hope. The tire tracks were heading downhill, away from the village, suggesting that any enemy forces had already passed through this area. More importantly, the tracks proved that the road was still passable for vehicles, which meant the families with elderly and disabled members might actually be able to make the journey. Maria pressed forward, documenting every obstacle and landmark in a small notebook she always carried. She sketched rough maps showing where the road narrowed dangerously, where streams needed to be crossed, and where alternative paths existed if the main route was blocked. This information could mean the difference between life and death for the entire community. The most dangerous section came at midday when the trail passed through a narrow canyon where voices echoed loudly. Maria had to move with extreme caution, knowing that even the slightest sound could alert enemy forces to her presence. She removed her boots and walked barefoot across the rocky ground, ignoring the sharp stones that cut her feet. It was here that she encountered her first real test. As she crept around a blind corner, Maria came face to face with 2 enemy soldiers sitting beside their motorcycle, sharing cigarettes and consulting a map. They were positioned directly on the path she needed to follow, and there was no alternative route through the canyon. Maria's medical training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but her hands trembled as she slowly backed away from the soldiers. She could hear them discussing patrol schedules and talking about clearing operations in nearby villages. The casual way they mentioned burning homes and relocating civilians made her stomach turn with anger and fear. For 30 agonizing minutes, Maria hid behind a fallen tree, waiting for the soldiers to move on. She used the time to study their equipment and behavior, noting that they seemed relaxed and confident, not expecting any resistance in this remote area. When they finally started their motorcycle and drove away, she waited another full hour before continuing her journey. The afternoon brought new challenges as storm clouds gathered overhead. Rain would make the mountain trails even more treacherous, but it might also provide cover for moving a large group of people. Maria found herself praying for just enough rainfall to mask the sound of 487 people walking through the wilderness, but not so much that elderly villagers and small children would be unable to navigate the slippery paths. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Maria began to recognize landmarks from her childhood adventures with her father. The old wooden bridge across Miller's Creek was still standing, though it looked dangerously rickety. The abandoned mining office where she used to play as a girl had partially collapsed, but the concrete foundation could provide shelter if needed. Most importantly, she could see the valley on the other side of the mountain range, the promised land where her people could find safety. The sight of that distant green valley filled her with renewed determination. The route was difficult and dangerous, but it was possible, She could lead her community to safety if she could just convince them to trust her with their lives. But as Maria prepared for the return journey to her village, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A convoy of enemy vehicles was moving along the main evacuation road below, the very route Captain Petrov had planned to use. Flames and smoke rose from several points along the highway, suggesting that other refugee groups had already been attacked. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The conventional escape route was no longer safe. The mountain path she was scouting wasn't just an alternative anymore. It was the only way out. 487 lives now depended entirely on her ability to guide them through this treacherous wilderness without losing a single person. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Maria turned back toward her village, carrying with her the knowledge that could save her entire community. The most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. Now she had to convince nearly 500 frightened people to follow her into the unknown. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time Maria stumbled back into the village as darkness fell. What she found there broke her heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. The enemy had indeed arrived, but they had withdrawn after a brief skirmish with Captain Petrov's small defense force. However, their message was clear. They would return in the morning with overwhelming numbers. The villagers had gathered in the old church, the largest building that could shelter everyone. Children slept fitfully on makeshift beds while adults whispered anxiously about their impossible situation. The main evacuation route had been completely cut off by enemy forces, and several other villages along that road had been destroyed with no survivors. Maria, Captain Petrov rushed to her as she entered the church, her clothes soaked and her feet bleeding from the treacherous mountain journey. "Thank God you're alive. We thought you were captured or killed when we heard gunfire in the mountains." "The route is possible," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded church. "Difficult but possible. I made it to the other side of the mountain range. There's a safe valley beyond where we can find shelter with friendly forces." A murmur of hope rippled through the gathered families, but it was quickly followed by concerned voices. Old Henrik, the village blacksmith, struggled to his feet with his walking cane. "Maria, child, we appreciate what you've done, but look around you. We have newborn babies, wheelchair-bound elderly, people with heart conditions who can barely walk to the market. How can we possibly navigate mountain trails in this weather?" Maria pulled out her notebook and spread her rough maps on the altar. "I've planned the route carefully. There are places to rest, sources of fresh water, and even some shelter along the way. Yes, it will be challenging, but the alternative is certain death if we stay here." Young Dr. Fedorov, who had recently graduated from medical school and come to assist in the village clinic, studied her maps with professional interest. "Maria, I understand your optimism, but we need to be realistic. Mrs. Kozlov can barely walk to her garden. Little Anton needs his wheelchair and medical equipment. And what about pregnant Elena? She's due to give birth any day now." "Then we'll carry them," Maria replied simply. "We'll make stretchers for those who cannot walk. We'll take turns carrying the children. We'll help each other because that's what families do." Captain Petrov looked skeptical. "Even if the route is technically possible, Maria, you're talking about moving nearly 500 people through enemy territory in complete secrecy. One crying baby, one stumble that causes noise, one person who can't keep up, and we could all be discovered and killed." Maria felt the weight of doubt pressing down on the room. She could see the fear in every face, the reasonable concerns about impossible logistics, the desperate wish for a safer alternative that simply didn't exist. But she also saw something else. A flicker of hope in the eyes of mothers holding their children, the stubborn determination of elderly folks who had survived previous wars. "Let me tell you what I saw today," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I saw enemy patrols on every major road. I saw the smoke rising from burned villages where families just like ours tried to escape using conventional routes. I saw convoys of refugees that never made it to safety." She pointed to her muddy boots and torn clothing. "But I also walked a path that enemy forces don't know exists. I found places where we can hide if patrols come near. I discovered that the old mining roads can still support vehicles, which means we can bring wheelchairs and medical supplies." Elena, the pregnant woman, placed her hand protectively over her swollen belly. "But what if I go into labor during the journey? What if something goes wrong with the baby?" Maria knelt beside her and took her hands gently. "Elena, I delivered your first child 3 years ago, remember? I've brought over 200 babies into this world. If your time comes during the journey, I'll take care of you and your baby just like always." Father Mikhail, the elderly priest who had served the community for 40 years, slowly stood up. "My friends, I have lived through 3 wars and seen many impossible situations. Sometimes God asks us to choose between different kinds of danger. We can stay here and face certain death, or we can follow Maria into uncertain danger with hope for survival." Mrs. Kozlov, the stubborn old woman who had initially refused to leave her home, surprised everyone by speaking up. "That girl walked into the mountains alone today to find us a way out. She came back bleeding and exhausted, but she came back with hope. If Maria Volkov says she can lead us to safety, then I trust her with my life." The testimonials continued as other villagers shared their faith in Maria. They remembered how she had saved lives during the influenza epidemic 5 years earlier, working day and night without rest. They recalled her calm competence during medical emergencies, her ability to make life and death decisions under pressure. But it was young Dmitri, barely 16 years old, who provided the most compelling argument. "My grandmother always said that in desperate times, ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things. Maria isn't asking us to trust a stranger. She's asking us to trust someone who has been taking care of us our whole lives." Captain Petrov studied the faces around the church, seeing the gradual shift from despair to cautious hope. "If we do this, we need to be organized. Everyone must carry only essential supplies. We move in complete silence. Anyone who cannot maintain the pace or follow instructions exactly could endanger the entire group. Then we'll make sure everyone can maintain the pace," Maria replied firmly. "We'll help each other. We'll share the burden. We'll do whatever it takes to get everyone to safety." As the rain continued to pound against the church windows, 487 people made the most important decision of their lives. They would trust Maria Volkov to lead them through the treacherous mountains, betting everything on the slim hope that love and determination could overcome impossible odds. The exodus would begin at dawn, just hours before enemy reinforcements were expected to arrive. There would be no second chances, no turning back, and no room for error. Success meant survival for an entire community. Failure meant death for everyone Maria had ever cared about. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time Maria stumbled back into the village as darkness fell. What she found there broke her heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. The enemy had indeed arrived, but they had withdrawn after a brief skirmish with Captain Petrov's small defense force. However, their message was clear. They would return in the morning with overwhelming numbers. The villagers had gathered in the old church, the largest building that could shelter everyone. Children slept fitfully on makeshift beds while adults whispered anxiously about their impossible situation. The main evacuation route had been completely cut off by enemy forces, and several other villages along that road had been destroyed with no survivors. "Maria," Captain Petrov rushed to her as she entered the church, her clothes soaked and her feet bleeding from the treacherous mountain journey. "Thank God you're alive. We thought you were captured or killed when we heard gunfire in the mountains." "The route is possible," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded church. "Difficult but possible. I made it to the other side of the mountain range. There's a safe valley beyond where we can find shelter with friendly forces." A murmur of hope rippled through the gathered families, but it was quickly followed by concerned voices. Old Henrik, the village blacksmith, struggled to his feet with his walking cane. "Maria, child, we appreciate what you've done, but look around you. We have newborn babies, wheelchair-bound elderly, people with heart conditions who can barely walk to the market. How can we possibly navigate mountain trails in this weather?" Maria pulled out her notebook and spread her rough maps on the altar. "I've planned the route carefully. There are places to rest, sources of fresh water, and even some shelter along the way. Yes, it will be challenging, but the alternative is certain death if we stay here." Young Dr. Fedorov, who had recently graduated from medical school and come to assist in the village clinic, studied her maps with professional interest. "Maria, I understand your optimism, but we need to be realistic. Mrs. Kozlov can barely walk to her garden. Little Anton needs his wheelchair and medical equipment. And what about pregnant Elena? She's due to give birth any day now." "Then we'll carry them," Maria replied simply. "We'll make stretchers for those who cannot walk. We'll take turns carrying the children. We'll help each other because that's what families do." Captain Petrov looked skeptical. "Even if the route is technically possible, Maria, You're talking about moving nearly 500 people through enemy territory in complete secrecy. One crying baby, one stumble that causes noise, one person who can't keep up, and we could all be discovered and killed. Maria felt the weight of doubt pressing down on the room. She could see the fear in every face, the reasonable concerns about impossible logistics, the desperate wish for a safer alternative that simply didn't exist. But she also saw something else. A flicker of hope in the eyes of mothers holding their children, the stubborn determination of elderly folks who had survived previous wars. "Let me tell you what I saw today," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I saw enemy patrols on every major road. I saw the smoke rising from burned villages where families just like ours tried to escape using conventional routes. I saw convoys of refugees that never made it to safety." She pointed to her muddy boots and torn clothing. "But I also walked a path that enemy forces don't know exists. I found places where we can hide if patrols come near. I discovered that the old mining roads can still support vehicles, which means we can bring wheelchairs and medical supplies." Elena, the pregnant woman, placed her hand protectively over her swollen belly. "But what if I go into labor during the journey? What if something goes wrong with the baby?" Maria knelt beside her and took her hands gently. "Elena, I delivered your first child 3 years ago, remember? I've brought over 200 babies into this world. If your time comes during the journey, I'll take care of you and your baby just like always." Father Mikhail, the elderly priest who had served the community for 40 years, slowly stood up. "My friends, I have lived through 3 wars and seen many impossible situations. Sometimes God asks us to choose between different kinds of danger. We can stay here and face certain death, or we can follow Maria into uncertain danger with hope for survival." Mrs. Kozlov, the stubborn old woman who had initially refused to leave her home, surprised everyone by speaking up. "That girl walked into the mountains alone today to find us a way out. She came back bleeding and exhausted, but she came back with hope. If Maria Volkov says she can lead us to safety, then I trust her with my life." The testimonials continued as other villagers shared their faith in Maria. They remembered how she had saved lives during the influenza epidemic 5 years earlier, working day and night without rest. They recalled her calm competence during medical emergencies, her ability to make life and death decisions under pressure. But it was young Dmitri, barely 16 years old, who provided the most compelling argument. "My grandmother always said that in desperate times, ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things. Maria isn't asking us to trust a stranger. She's asking us to trust someone who has been taking care of us our whole lives." Captain Petrov studied the faces around the church, seeing the gradual shift from despair to cautious hope. "If we do this, we need to be organized. Everyone must carry only essential supplies. We move in complete silence. Anyone who cannot maintain the pace or follow instructions exactly could endanger the entire group. Then we'll make sure everyone can maintain the pace." Maria replied firmly. "We'll help each other. We'll share the burden. We'll do whatever it takes to get everyone to safety." As the rain continued to pound against the church windows, 487 people made the most important decision of their lives. They would trust Maria Volkov to lead them through the treacherous mountains, betting everything on the slim hope that love and determination could overcome impossible odds. The exodus would begin at dawn, just hours before enemy reinforcements were expected to arrive. There would be no second chances, no turning back, and no room for error. Success meant survival for an entire community. Failure meant death for everyone Maria had ever cared about. The second day began before dawn with a crisis that threatened to destroy everything Maria had worked to achieve. Elena, the pregnant woman who had experienced false labor the day before, was now in active labor with real, powerful contractions that could not be stopped or delayed. The baby was coming whether they were in a mountain wilderness or a fully equipped hospital. "We have to stop," Dr. Fedorov whispered urgently to Maria as Elena gripped her husband's hand and tried not to scream. "She needs a clean, warm place to deliver. We can't have a birth on the mountainside with enemy patrols in the area." Maria looked around at the 485 other people depending on her leadership. They were in an extremely exposed position on a narrow trail with no cover from aircraft and no alternative routes. Stopping here could mean death for everyone if they were discovered. But abandoning a woman in labor was unthinkable. "Boris," she called to the shepherd leader, "is there any shelter nearby? A cave, an abandoned building, anything?" The old mountain man studied the terrain thoughtfully. "There's an old mining station about half a mile up the trail. Concrete building, partially collapsed but still has a roof. Problem is it's visible from the air and sits right on the main path. Captain Petrov shook his head grimly. Too dangerous. If enemy reconnaissance spots us there, we'll be trapped with nowhere to run. But Elena let out a suppressed moan that made the decision for everyone. The baby was coming now, and there was no medical way to stop or delay the birth. Maria made the hardest command decision of her life. "We take the mining station," she announced. "Boris, take Elena and the medical team there immediately. Everyone else continue on the main trail and take cover in the forest below. If enemy forces come, you keep moving without us." "Maria, no," protested Elena's husband. "Don't split the group for us. We'll manage somehow." "Listen to me," Maria said firmly, gripping his shoulders. "Your wife is about to give birth to the 488th member of our community. That baby deserves the same chance at life as everyone else here. We don't abandon family." Dr. Fedorov, Captain Petrov, and 6 other volunteers stayed with Maria to help with the birth, while the main group continued toward safer ground. As Elena was carefully moved to the concrete shelter, her contractions intensified rapidly, indicating the baby would arrive within hours. The abandoned mining station was exactly as Boris had described, partially destroyed but offering just enough shelter and privacy for an emergency delivery. Maria quickly organized her volunteers to create a sterile birthing environment, using medical supplies and clean blankets from their emergency kit. "This is insane," Dr. Fedorov muttered as he helped prepare the makeshift delivery room. "We're about to deliver a baby in a war zone with enemy forces actively searching for us. Then we better deliver this baby quickly and quietly," Maria replied with the calm competence that had carried her through 15 years of medical emergencies. "Elena, you've done this before. You know what to do. We're going to help your baby come into the world safely." The birth proceeded with surprising smoothness despite the terrifying circumstances. Elena proved to be remarkably strong and focused, managing her labor pains without the screaming that could attract enemy attention. Her husband provided emotional support while Maria and Dr. Fedorov handled the medical aspects of delivery. But just as the baby's head began to crown, they heard the distant sound of helicopter engines approaching from the south. Captain Petrov immediately signaled for complete silence while moving to the window to assess the threat. Through his binoculars, he could see military aircraft conducting a systematic search pattern of the mountain area. "They're looking for us," he whispered urgently. 3 helicopters flying low, checking every building and clearing. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Elena's face went white with terror, but Maria gripped her hand firmly. "Elena, listen to me. Your baby is almost here. We need 3 more good pushes, and then your child will be born. Can you do that quietly?" The next few minutes tested everyone's courage and self-control. Elena pushed with silent determination, while Maria guided the baby's delivery with steady hands. Outside, the helicopter engines grew louder, as the search pattern brought enemy aircraft closer to their position. Just as the first helicopter passed directly overhead, Elena's baby emerged into the world, a perfect, healthy boy who took his first breath without crying. Maria quickly cleared his airway and wrapped him in a warm blanket. Amazed by this tiny miracle born in the midst of war and danger. "He's beautiful," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her newborn son. "And so quiet, like he knows he needs to keep us all safe." The helicopters circled the area for another 20 minutes before moving on to search other sections of the mountain range. During that terrifying time, 8 adults and 1 newborn baby sat in complete silence, hardly daring to breathe while enemy forces hunted them from above. When the aircraft finally disappeared beyond the northern ridgeline, Captain Petrov allowed himself a small smile. "Well, Maria, you've officially delivered the most dangerous baby in military history, and you did it without making a sound." But their relief was short-lived. As they prepared to rejoin the main group with Elena and her newborn son, Boris the shepherd returned with devastating news. Enemy ground forces had discovered the trail and were following the refugee column's tracks. The main group was only 3 hours ahead of armed patrols that were gaining ground rapidly. "We need to warn them," Maria said immediately, "and we need to find a way to hide 487 people from a military search operation." Boris studied his mountain maps with growing excitement. "There might be a way. The old mining complex goes much deeper into the mountain than most people know. Underground tunnels that could hide everyone until the patrols pass through." "Underground?" Dr. Fedorov looked skeptical. "Elena just gave birth. She needs rest, warmth, and medical monitoring. A cold, damp tunnel could be dangerous for both her and the baby. Maria looked at Elena, who was nursing her newborn son with fierce determination. "What do you think? Can you handle another difficult journey to keep your baby safe?" Elena's answer surprised everyone. This little boy was born in a war zone without making a sound. He's already proven he's tough enough for whatever comes next. Let's go save our community. As they prepared to leave the mining station, Maria realized that Elena's baby represented something profound, hope for the future, proof that life could triumph even in the darkest circumstances. The boy who would grow up knowing that 487 people had risked everything to ensure his safe birth into the world. The race to save their community had entered its most critical phase. Enemy forces were closing in. Underground tunnels offered uncertain refuge, and Maria's leadership would be tested as never before. But for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly confident about their chances. If they could deliver a baby in a war zone, they could accomplish anything. The underground mining tunnels were a maze of darkness and echoing sounds that seemed to swallow their small group as they descended into the mountain's depths. Boris led the way with an old mining lamp, its weak beam barely illuminating the rocky walls and dangerous drop-offs that could kill unwary travelers. Behind him, Maria carried Elena's newborn baby while Dr. Fedorov helped the new mother navigate the treacherous underground terrain. The main cavern is about half a mile ahead, Boris explained in a whisper that somehow seemed loud in the underground silence. Big enough to hold 500 people, with several exit tunnels in case we need alternative escape routes. Captain Petrov had remained above ground to establish contact with the main refugee group and guide them to the tunnel entrance. His military radio crackled with urgent reports. Enemy ground forces were now only 90 minutes behind the civilian column and closing fast. Nearly 487 people needed to disappear completely within the next hour, or face certain capture and likely death. When Maria's small group finally reached the main cavern, she was amazed by what they found. The underground space was enormous, easily large enough to shelter their entire community, with natural ventilation shafts that would provide fresh air. Ancient mining equipment and wooden support beams suggested the tunnels were structurally sound, though decades of abandonment had left everything covered in dust and debris. This could actually work, Dr. Fedorov admitted as he examined the cavern with his medical flashlight. The temperature is constant. There's fresh water seeping through the rock walls, and the acoustics mean we could communicate quietly without sound carrying to the surface. Elena settled into a relatively comfortable corner where blankets had been spread over smooth rock formations. Her baby continued to sleep peacefully, apparently unaffected by their underground refuge. "It's strange," she murmured to Maria, "but I feel safer down here than I have since this whole nightmare began." The first groups of refugees began arriving within 30 minutes, guided by Captain Petrov and several volunteers who had memorized the route to the cavern. The sight of 487 people filing into the underground sanctuary was both miraculous and heartbreaking. Families clutching their precious possessions, elderly villagers helped by younger neighbors, children wide-eyed with wonder and fear at their underground hideout. Mrs. Kozlov, supported by her two helpers, looked around the cavern with surprising approval. "Well, this reminds me of the root cellars we used during the last war. Not comfortable, but definitely safe from bombs and bullets." The logistics of hiding nearly 500 people underground presented challenges Maria hadn't anticipated. Sanitation became an immediate concern, requiring the designation of specific areas for waste disposal that wouldn't contaminate their water sources. Food distribution had to be organized to ensure everyone received adequate nutrition without depleting their limited supplies too quickly. Most critically, they needed to maintain absolute silence while enemy patrols searched the mountainside above them. Children had to be kept quiet and calm, which meant organizing whispered storytelling sessions and silent games that would occupy young minds without creating noise. Teenagers were assigned to help. Elderly community members find comfortable positions for what could be an extended underground stay. Dr. Fedorov established a medical station in a side alcove where he could treat minor injuries and monitor the health of vulnerable community members. Several elderly villagers were showing signs of exhaustion and stress, while a few children had developed coughs that could become dangerous if the conditions turned into pneumonia. "How long can we stay down here?" Maria asked Boris as they surveyed their underground community. "Depends on several factors," the shepherd replied thoughtfully. Food and water aren't problems. There are underground streams, and we brought enough supplies for several days. The real question is whether enemy forces will give up searching, or whether they'll discover the tunnel entrances. As if summoned by his words, the sound of boots and voices echoed down from the surface. Captain Petrov appeared at the cavern entrance, moving quickly and quietly to report the latest developments. "Enemy patrol is directly above us," he whispered urgently. 20 soldiers with tracking equipment, systematically searching every building and hiding place. They found evidence of our passage and know we're somewhere in this area. The cavern fell completely silent as 487 people held their breath, listening to the muffled sounds of military search operations taking place just above their heads. Children pressed close to their parents. Elderly villagers closed their eyes and prayed silently. Even Elena's newborn seemed to sense the danger. Sleeping without the smallest sound, for 2 hours, they endured the terrifying experience of listening to enemy soldiers walking directly over their underground refuge. Voices could be heard discussing search patterns. Radio communications reported negative findings to commanders, and at one point, soldiers seemed to be standing directly over one of the concealed tunnel entrances. It was during this most dangerous period that Maria realized the true magnitude of what they had achieved. Nearly 500 people were maintaining perfect silence in an underground cavern, supporting each other through the most frightening experience of their lives. Neighbors shared water and food without being asked. Parents comforted not only their own children but any child who seemed frightened. Elderly community members offered quiet words of encouragement to younger folks who were struggling with claustrophobia or panic. The crisis moment came when little Dmitri, the 8-year-old son of the village baker, developed a severe coughing fit that threatened to give away their location. His mother, Sophia, looked desperate as her son struggled to suppress the loud coughs that could echo up to the surface. Without hesitation, Maria quickly moved to the child and administered a mild suppressant from her medical kit. But more importantly, she organized an impromptu sound barrier by having everyone in the immediate area move closer together and create a human wall that would muffle any noise. Dr. Fedorov helped by using breathing techniques that calmed the child's respiratory distress. The community response was immediate and instinctive. People who barely knew the family moved to help, offering their own children's medication, sharing warm clothing to prevent further coughing, and positioning themselves to provide maximum sound insulation. It was a perfect example of how their underground sanctuary had become more than just a hiding place. It had become a demonstration of what human beings could accomplish when they truly cared for each other. As evening fell and the sounds of enemy patrols finally moved away from their area, Boris brought encouraging news from his reconnaissance of the upper tunnels. The search teams have moved on to other sectors. They didn't find any evidence of the tunnel entrances, and their radio communications suggest they believe we've moved much further east. Maria felt the tension begin to ease throughout the cavern as people realized they had successfully hidden from enemy forces. But she also knew this was only the beginning of their underground ordeal. They needed to remain hidden until the enemy patrols completely cleared the area, which could take several more days. "We did it," Elena whispered, holding her baby close. "All of us together, we actually did it." But Maria's experience told her that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Keeping 487 people healthy, fed, and hopeful in an underground cavern would test their community bonds in ways that surface dangers never could. 3 days later, Maria stood at the exit of the underground tunnels watching as 487 souls emerged into sunlight and freedom. The scene was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Families embracing in the warm morning air, children laughing as they ran through green grass, elderly villagers weeping with relief as they realized their incredible journey was finally over. The valley, beyond the mountains, was everything Maria had promised during those dark moments when hope seemed impossible. Allied forces had established a refugee camp with proper medical facilities, adequate food supplies, and temporary housing that felt like luxury after their underground ordeal. Most importantly, they were safe from enemy forces that had given up searching the mountain areas and moved on to other targets. Elena sat on a wooden bench, nursing her baby son while watching other children play nearby. "Maria," she called out, "have you chosen a name for our miracle baby yet? After everything you did to bring him safely into this world, I think you've earned that right." Maria knelt beside the new mother, and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "I think his name should be Hope," she said softly, "because that's what he represented during our darkest hours, proof that life and love can triumph over any danger." Dr. Fedorov approached with a clipboard full of medical reports, his face beaming with pride and amazement. "Maria, I've completed health assessments for everyone in our group. Do you want to know the incredible statistics of what we accomplished?" "Tell me," Maria replied, though part of her almost afraid to hear the numbers that would define their miraculous journey. 487 people entered those mountains with you 4 days ago, Dr. Fedorov announced. 488 people emerged safely, counting baby Hope. 0 casualties, 0 serious injuries, 0 people left behind. In military terminology, that's a 100% mission success rate. Captain Petrov joined their small group, still amazed by what they had witnessed. "Maria, I've been a soldier for 20 years and I've never seen anything like what happened in those mountains. You took nearly 500 civilians through enemy territory using routes that military experts would have called impossible." "We all did it together," Maria corrected him. "Every single person contributed something essential. The teenagers who carried elderly villagers, the mothers who kept children calm and quiet, the old folks who shared their wisdom and strength, even little Hope, who was born without making a sound that could endanger everyone." Mrs. Kozlov, now resting comfortably in a proper chair with medical oxygen to help her breathing, grabbed Maria's hand with surprising strength. "Child, I want to tell you something important. I've lived through wars, famines, and every kind of disaster you can imagine. But what I saw in those mountains was the most beautiful thing in my 80 years of life." "What do you mean?" Maria asked. "I watched 487 strangers become one family," the elderly woman explained, her eyes bright with tears. "People who had barely spoken to each other before became willing to risk everything for their neighbors. Children shared their food with elderly folks they didn't know. Teenagers volunteered to carry disabled community members without being asked. Boris, the shepherd who had guided them through the most dangerous sections, approached with news that brought their story full circle. "Maria, I just received radio contact from friendly forces in the area. Your village has been liberated. Enemy forces withdrew after holding it for only 2 days. The buildings are damaged but still standing." "Does that mean we can go home?" asked young Dmitri, the boy whose coughing had nearly exposed their underground hideout. Maria looked around at the faces of her community, the families who had trusted her with their lives, the children who had been braver than any adult could have expected, the elderly villagers who had endured impossible hardships without complaint. They could indeed go home, but they would never be the same people who had left that village 4 days earlier. "Yes, we can go home," she answered. "But first I think we need to talk about what we learned during our journey." Over the following days, as the community rested and recovered in the refugee camp, extraordinary stories emerged from their mountain ordeal. Families discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. Neighbors who had maintained polite but distant relationships for years found deep bonds forged in shared danger. Children had learned lessons about courage and community that would shape their entire lives. Elena's baby Hope became a symbol of their collective triumph, but he wasn't the only new life that emerged from their journey. Several elderly villagers who had been resigned to quiet deaths in their homes found renewed purpose in helping younger community members. Teenagers who had been considered irresponsible proved themselves capable of extraordinary maturity and selflessness. Most remarkably, the experience had created a new kind of extended family among people who had previously been mere neighbors. Mrs. Kozlov was formally adopted as a grandmother by 3 different families who wanted to ensure she would never face danger alone again. Young parents asked elderly community members to serve as additional grandparents for children who had been separated from extended family by the war. Dr. Fedorov documented these social changes as carefully as he had recorded their medical statistics. "Maria, what happened in those mountains wasn't just a successful evacuation. It was a transformation of an entire community. These people will never see each other as strangers again." When they finally returned to their village 3 weeks later, the homecoming celebration lasted for days. Every family that had made the mountain journey was welcomed as heroes by neighbors who had evacuated through other routes. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and permanent bonds were formed between people who had proven they would risk everything for each other. The village church held a special ceremony where Father Mikhail blessed baby Hope and officially recognized him as a symbol of their community's rebirth. Maria was asked to speak about their journey, but she found herself struggling to find words that could capture the magnitude of what 487 people had accomplished together. When I walked into those mountains 4 days ago, she finally said, I thought I was trying to save 487 lives. What I discovered was that 487 people were actually saving each other. Every single person on that journey was both a rescuer and someone being rescued. Years later, when historians studied the events of that terrible war, the story of Maria Volkov and the 487 families became legendary. Military academies taught courses analyzing the tactical brilliance of their mountain evacuation. Medical schools used their experience to train doctors in emergency field medicine, but most importantly, communities around the world learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they truly cared for each other. Baby Hope grew up knowing he was born during one of the most dangerous and beautiful moments in his village's history. Mrs. Kozlov lived for 15 more years, becoming the beloved grandmother of dozens of children whose parents had carried her to safety in the mountains. Dr. Fedorov established a medical training program that taught other healthcare workers how to organize community evacuations during wartime emergencies, and Maria Volkov continued working as a village nurse, delivering babies and caring for her neighbors with the same quiet competence that had saved 487 families. But everyone who knew her understood that she was far more than a medical professional. She was proof that love and determination could overcome any obstacle when people were willing to help each other survive impossible challenges. The mountain trail they had used became known as Hope's Path, and a small monument was erected marking the spot where Elena gave birth during their escape. The inscription was simple but profound. Here in the darkest hour, 488 lights refused to be extinguished.